Let me get your official position in Canada at McGill, first of all, your name and what your position is.
Yeah, my name is PAYAM Akhavan. I'm a professor of international law at McGill University, formerly a UN war crimes prosecutor at The Hague, and co-founder of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center.
I want to ask you, first of all, about this issue of where does rape fit into the human rights picture and the general picture that people have of Iran. It's small, but it's lethal in my opinion, but I'd be interested if you put it in context.
Mm-hmm. Well, rape is a particularly serious form of sexual violence, which qualifies in international law as a form of torture. It is included as one of the acts that constitute crimes against humanity under the statute of the International Criminal Court. Historically, the prosecution of rape and reporting of rape as a human rights violations has been a problem because of the shame and stigma which is felt by the victims, who then are reluctant to come forward and tell their stories. And at the War Crimes Tribunal at The Hague, when we were looking into the use of rape as a weapon of war in Yugoslavia, it was very difficult to gain the confidence of victims so that they would be able to testify. In Iran, for the past 30 years, since the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran, there have been many accounts of the use of rape in prisons as a form really of torture, of terrorizing prisoners into submission. In particular, there have been accounts of women who were slated for execution being raped prior to their execution because of the belief that a virgin will go to paradise, and therefore her virginity must be taken away prior to her execution. And one way of really interpreting this is to consider that there are those elements within the Islamic Republic that genuinely believe that these are tenets of Islamic law, and that they are, however much we find horrifying their conduct, they are in good faith trying to interpret what they believe to be Islamic law. Another interpretation, which I think is more accurate, is that Islam is appropriated and used as an instrument of abuse at the will of the leadership of the Islamic Republic, whose only interest is survival and perpetuation of its own interests.
Rape is not a part of Islam, or is not part of the culture of Iran traditionally, is it?
Like many other acts, such as the veiling of women, a whole lot of other allegedly Islamic practices, no, there is no justification whatsoever for rape, or torture, or other such practices. It's all a question of the latitude certain self-appointed Islamic clerics give themselves to interpret the Sharia law as they please. And when you mix religion with politics, and religious interpretation, or rather the monopoly over religious interpretation, becomes an instrument of power, well, you have all the elements that are necessary for the corruption of Islam, or any other religion for that matter, to suit the agenda of political leaders who are pursuing simply their own self-interest.
Because we're always looking for something new and unprecedented in this business, and it seems to me, after 35 years of making documentaries and doing journalism around the world, I've never heard of religious rape before. And people will find it hard to believe, I think, that there is such a thing as religious rape, as we lay out in this documentary. Do you believe that in these cases you can describe it as religious rape?
Well, it is rape that is seemingly justified by reference to religion. So in that sense, one could say that it is religious rape. But at another level, it is simply a form of torture, brutality, and inhumanity, which is rationalized by religion, which happens to be the ideology of the Islamic Republic. Throughout history, one of the problems that totalitarian regimes have had is to rationalize violence. Now, in Nazi Germany, the Einsatzgruppen that were responsible for the massacre of civilians in Eastern Europe regularly had signs of psychological breakdown, because you have a man who is going and murdering women and children and then coming back home in the weekend and sitting at the dinner table with his women and children. And there is an incongruence between those two realities. And even in Nazi Germany, the members of the killing squads had to receive therapy. They had to receive psychotherapy because of the deep senses of guilt and shame which they felt. So what do you do in the context of the Islamic Republic, where at least the Basij and all the militias that are blindly obedient to the state owe their obedience to allegiance to the word of God, to the word of Islam as represented by the regime? Well, you deploy religion as a justification for all the crimes that they're committing. You dehumanize the victims as enemies of God, and then leave them open to all forms of abuse. So here it is simply a case of religion being strategically deployed to dehumanize the victim in order to justify this sort of violence.
We have a clip in the documentary of the Ayatollah Khamenei. My pronunciation is probably a bit off, but these questions...
No, that's correct, Khamenei, yeah.
Who seems to be saying in the tumult after the June election that these protesters, he goes on a bit of a rant about the protesters, and then he says in a very, very chilling clip, and I've been in a lot of churches and a lot of synagogues and seen a lot of religious leaders speak. He says in a very chilling way that we will send the word out to our commanders that these people will get to know them very soon. What could he possibly have been thinking?
The message is very clear. Ayatollah Khamenei, as the supreme leader, who is also the supreme commander of the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij militia that were responsible for these widespread abuses, is basically saying that we will instill the fear of God into the dissidents in Iran, and we will do so through extreme violence. And there is not a great distance between his ominous statements and what in fact happened, not in one location, but throughout the country. This is not a case of one or two bad cops that commit excesses. This is a deliberate policy of terrorization of the Iranian people. And we must bear in mind that although it took the protests of 2009 for the international community to really notice what is happening, that this pattern of abuse is not new. For 30 years, this is what the Islamic Republic did behind closed doors in the torture chambers of Iranian prisons. The difference was that by 2009, that violence was out in the street for everybody to witness. And one important consideration, which I think is a historic turning point in the legitimacy of the regime, is the statement by Mehdi Karoubi, one of the two opposition leaders, who's an Islamic cleric, who was once the Speaker of the Parliament in Iran, who is clearly an insider in the Islamic regime. When he stood up after the protests, and for the first time in the history of the Islamic Republic as a leader, said that the children of Iran are being raped in the prisons, I think that that was the beginning of the end for the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic.
All of these people believe in this word, follow these instructions, and in our particular case, we've proved the line of command through the Basiji commander to this defector. A gang rape. How can any man of God and any Iranian citizen justify rape in the name of God? It just boggles the mind.
The vast majority of Iran's youthful population, 70% of which are under 30 years of age, wants a democratic, open society. That's what we saw in the summer of 2009 when millions of people across the country peacefully protested, calling for fair elections, calling for human rights, calling for equality and an open society. It is the case, of course, that the regime has a base. Every regime has a base, an element of the population through which it finds support. That element of the population is quite small. By some estimates, 10 to 15% of the population. And one of the challenges of the democratic movement in Iran is how to win hearts and minds, how to effect a non-violent transition to democracy. And that is part of the discipline of this movement. That is part of the threat that it represents to the regime. If the regime could justify its repression in the face of violence by the opposition, it would make things much easier for them. The regime has survived, but it has lost its legitimacy. And those same mobs that today are chanting in support of the regime, many of them have financial interests, they have political interests, some of them have been brainwashed. It is possible either to win them over, given an opportunity to educate society about the crimes of the past, about the many lies that they've been told through the years,